Welcome everybody to our working from home conversation with the Anti-Slavery Collective. Today we have the wonderful James Cockayne, who is the director of the Center for Policy Research at the United Nations University. So thank you so much for coming, James.
Wonderful to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation.
And we see you're in the assembly right now, so that's great.
Well, I'm not. I'm actually in Australia, but I thought in honor of our conversation, I put up this nice UN General Assembly backdrop with Nadia Murad on it in honor of all she's achieved for this cause.
Well, that's great that you're all the way in Australia and we're all the way in London. So we're truly doing a world call today. James, could you tell our listeners and viewers sort of what you do and how you got there and a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. I'm the head of a think tank that's part of the UN system. So we feel very lucky. We have the academic freedom to follow the evidence and give recommendations on policy to member states of the United Nations and the UN agencies, funds, programs, and the secretariat. We work on a whole range of issues from peacekeeping to modern slavery issues to global development issues. And
today we're going to be talking a bit about modern slavery and all the things that you're doing there with the Sustainable Development Goals and Goal 8.7 and things like that.
That's right. We have a number of projects at the Center for Policy Research that have looked in the last few years at how we can help countries take effective measures to end modern slavery. That's the commitment they made in Target 8.7 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. All countries signed up to those in 2015, and one of those, 8.7, is a commitment to try to take effective measures to end modern slavery by 2030. And as we know, there are about 40.3 million people in modern slavery at the moment, a big number when you think about it. That would mean dropping that number by about 10,000 every day between now and the end of 2030 to get to close to zero by then, which is that commitment under Target 8.7. So we help them investigate what the impacts of different interventions are to try and achieve that goal.
So James, we were lucky enough to see your talk from Davos this year, and you spoke about how modern slavery is a severe failure in terms of the market and the economy, the cost of cheap labour being far outweighed by its perceived benefits. Perhaps you could elaborate on that and then also touch on how COVID-19 has either demonstrated this to be true or not.
Sure. So when we say that modern slavery is a market failure, it's a little bit like saying climate change is a market failure. What we're talking about is that in the long run, the social costs of producing and consuming goods and services in that way actually outweigh the short-term benefits. So a market failure is generally understood to mean something that involves the suboptimal or inefficient supply of goods by the market, maybe because of asymmetric information in the market or because of mispricing. And the argument here is that when you look actually at the economic and social effects of goods generated relying on forced labor or modern slavery, it turns out in the long run, actually, it makes everybody worse off. And I think instinctively we recognize it makes the victims worse off. But what we're now beginning to realize is that because we're not pricing that labor, that means of production correctly, it's actually leaving everybody worse off. And what I mean by that is our productivity as a whole economy goes down. There's a disincentive for firms to incentivize because they can easily raise capital to rely on forced labor and modern slavery and produce goods cheaply that way. It creates intergenerational poverty. So people who are affected this way are less productive, and their children, it turns out, are less productive, and indeed their descendants are less productive. So it has a knock-on effect on human capital and actually in many other ways. And we're beginning now to be able to measure the cost of that. So in the UK, for example, some government researchers found a couple of years ago that the direct costs just to the public purse of a single case of modern slavery is about £328,000. And by the government's own estimates, there are something like 10,000 to 13,000 cases per year.
How do they work that out?
But they basically look at the physical effects, the lost productivity. They look at the healthcare costs. They look at the law enforcement costs. And actually, by their own recognition, that's a very conservative estimate. There's probably significantly more than that. And that's just the direct cost. They're not looking, for example, at whether these people are not, these people are removed from the economy. They're not spending or consuming or investing in the way that people who are free are. So we're actually missing out on that participation in the economy that they would otherwise have.
So it's the opportunity cost plus the cost on your government, police, care workers, etc.
That's it, exactly. And when we take that up a level from a single country, there's been some really interesting work just done by the IMF. So the IMF looked at what would be the economic benefit if we eradicated child marriage. So just one part of modern slavery, just child marriage. If we got rid of it tomorrow, how much better off would we all be? And they found that on average, every country's GDP would go up by just over 1%. Now, when you think about the low growth environment we're in, that is actually not small potatoes. That's actually a significant impact, and that's just child marriage. If we grew that out to other forms of forced marriage, some economists here in Australia whose work hasn't been published think that it might be between 3 and 5% GDP bump if we were able to get rid of modern slavery tomorrow. And I think you asked, Julia, about how COVID demonstrates this. Well, I think what we've learned from COVID is that we might fool ourselves into thinking that we are externalizing the cost of making workers vulnerable, that we're pushing all those costs down the supply chain, where we're separating our firms from them, we're creating a nice distance, but ultimately you cannot push them out of the system, those risks and costs. They're still part of the physical system that we all inhabit. And if those workers are vulnerable in some way to health impacts, then actually our supply chains are vulnerable, and overall the economy takes a knock when those risks are realized. I think we're realizing now that there's a bit of a fallacy in thinking, a bit of short-term thinking, and we're missing out on the bigger picture here.
So on the COVID example, obviously a lot of people who are enslaved have no protection or rights during this time. So whereas people in the UK might be furloughed by the government and have lots of support, now's the time that people enslaved are in even more trouble. And surely businesses and governments are weirdly benefiting from the fact that they don't have to provide protection to all of these people because they fly under the radar.
Yeah, look, I think this crisis is obviously disrupting everybody's lives, but I think it's increasing the risks for those enslaved already in many ways. I mean, we see terrible footage, for example, of enslaved maids in Lebanon, so Filipino maids climbing out the window and down the sides of apartment blocks to escape the terrible conditions. You can imagine it's tough enough being trapped inside, but imagine if you were trapped inside with your abuser and exploiter. We know that rates of normal domestic violence are going up. Well, imagine how much worse that may be for some people who are in such powerless situations as domestic slaves, for example. In India, we see migrant workers who are trapped and unable to access their normal income. They're living hand to mouth, trying to get home, trying to cross state borders, which have been closed, and in really dire physical risk. A number of them just this week killed on train tracks that they were walking along just trying to get home. And all these people lack access to care. And as you say, I think there's a greater level of impunity for anybody who's looking to exploit vulnerable workers at this time. There's an even greater level of impunity. Of course, there's also more risk that people get dragged into this situation in the first place. So we've got more and more people out of work. We know that negative shock to income is one of the main drivers that puts people in harm's way, at risk of being enslaved in the first place. So as we go through the difficult economic times that I think we have ahead, we're really going to need to pay close attention to the rising vulnerability to modern slavery and to think about what we can do about it. And then there's the third impact, right? That there's going to be less money available, let's be frank, for all of the frontline responders, all of the NGOs, all of the government programs that normally go to help these people. There's just going to be less money available. So we're all going to need to think very hard about our priorities and what we can do to support people in these difficult times.
You spoke earlier just about saying that 10,000 slaves have to be freed every day for us to end slavery by 2030. Obviously, with COVID, that's changed, but has that goal changed, and is that happening? And how do you sort of see that we can help get towards that number?
Yeah, I think the shocking truth is we actually don't know if we're making progress towards that goal. We've made this big rhetorical and frankly emotional commitment to people in this situation, and yet we're not actually able effectively to measure our progress towards that goal right now. There are new tools emerging thanks to the hard work of organizations like the International Labour Organization or the Walk Free Foundation that are improving our ability to find people who are hidden. Let's be honest, this is always going to be hard to measure because these people are hidden from the view of the state because this is illegal, the way they're being treated. But we don't really have a good snapshot of where we are against that goal. And I think that frankly is an indictment of our commitments as communities, as countries to this goal. If we're really serious, I think we would be doing better at measuring our progress towards it. We have to believe that COVID has increased the risks. We have to believe that it's making more people vulnerable. We know enough about what drives vulnerability to see that those risks are going up. So therefore the risk of enslavement and dangerous labour market decision-making must be going up, but it's very hard to measure right now. I'm optimistic though. We see some really creative and innovative things going on with the use of data sets or data that wasn't gathered for the purpose of measuring modern slavery, but it has the effect, if you use it cleverly, of allowing us to identify modern slavery. Some fantastic stuff. Yeah, I mean, some fantastic stuff going on in the artificial intelligence world, for example, which I think is near to your heart, Julia.
It is.
It is.
There's some really clever ways to use unstructured data sets now to understand when there are, for example, unexplained uses of factories going on. If you see high electricity patterns that don't match up with the declared output of that factory, something's going on there. And there's an incentive there for the local government to help you find out what's going on, because if in fact there's undeclared production, then that means they're missing out on tax revenue. So there's lots of creative ways to think about how we use data like that.
Our friends at the McCain Institute have created an algorithm that can scan an advert for sex, and by the turn of phrase and the language used, they can tell if that advert has been written by a girl selling herself or a pimp selling a girl on his behalf. And they can then pass that information onto the police to go and investigate. So that's another example of how AI is hopefully going to change the landscape and help us fight human trafficking. On the COVID point, are there any ways you hope that COVID will bring about positive change?
Yeah, there are actually two, I would say. But the first is, I think we all actually now believe change is possible more than we did before. To see how just habits, nothing to do with modern slavery, but things as simple as washing your hands or social distancing, to see how quickly people can change their habits when it's for a life or death reason. I think that's actually kind of inspiring. It reminds us that we are all capable of change, not just at an individual level, but collectively, if only we take the issue seriously enough. And I think that has some positive implications for modern slavery, because it is a life and death question for many people. Slavery is often being called a form of social death. It's about removing people as members of society. So we need to take it that seriously. I think I'm also optimistic, Julia, because we are already having a discussion in the economy about our need to price in the true social costs of the way we produce goods. I referred earlier to the climate change discussion. There are big structural conversations going on at the global level now and at the sectoral level about how do we price in carbon properly. Well, there's a whole process there that we can piggyback on with modern slavery in what the financial markets call ESG, so environmental, social, and governance issues, to get investors, get banks thinking about whether they're supporting, lending to, investing in, taking the deposits of firms that are relying on modern slavery. So if we already have that big structural conversation going on, and we've just been awoken to the possibility of structural change, I'm actually optimistic that if we're smart as an anti-slavery community, we have a real opening in the next couple of years to do something big.
And speaking towards the work of banks and the work you do there, can you talk a bit about your Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking initiative that you started?
Yeah, well, I didn't start it. It was a project really of the governments of Liechtenstein, the Netherlands, and Australia, and then Muhammad Yunus, the Nobel laureate and microfinance pioneer. And we're very lucky at the United Nations University Centre for Policy Research to be the secretariat for this process. So they got together a commission of 25 people, including 2 absolutely inspiring survivors of modern slavery, both of whom have worked with the financial sector in the past. One, James Kofi, was a survivor of child slavery in Ghana, and then managed to get an education afterwards and become a bank manager in Ghana. So he was amazing to have on the commission because he really had both sides of the story here. And then Timea Naji-Payne, who's a survivor who lives in Canada these days, and who used her own experience about 10 years ago to help banks understand how people who are in sex trafficking interact with the financial sector and the traces, the footprints they leave in transactions data. And she's achieved amazing things there. So we had them. And then we had people like the chief investment officer of the world's largest hedge fund. We had people from sovereign investment funds, from big pension funds, from brand name banks, as well as the anti-slavery movement, many of our friends in the anti-slavery movement. 25 people, and that was the aim of the commission, was to think about all of the different ways in which the financial sector is connected to this problem. And they published a blueprint for action by the financial sector, which is available on the website. It's fastinitiative.org. FAST stands for Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking. And anybody can go there, download the blueprint. There's a bunch of tools available, interactive risk mapping tools, leverage tools to understand how you can use your leverage over a company that you've invested in to get them to change their behavior, and a set of goals and actions for everybody to undertake to together achieve this big shift that I was talking about, so that we begin to actually price the true cost of labor into the way goods and services are made and consumed.
Wow, that sounds unbelievably incredible. And thank you so much for sharing that. I think a lot of people will be very interested to learn much more about that initiative.
Yeah, I think it's got huge potential. We're working with firms all over the world now, and with governments from Asia to the Americas on implementing that collective action framework, that blueprint. We have a new online certificate that will be coming out soon with the world's largest group of anti-money laundering specialists. So that's got 75,000 members worldwide, and we'll be helping them train their members in how to spot the indicators of human trafficking and work with law enforcement to tackle it. There's a huge scope for discussion in the investment community, as I said. I mean, at the moment, the way our capital markets are set up, we reward those firms whose costs are lower. And the way that you get your costs down, of course, is you keep labor costs down. So we do that by creating these long supply chains all the way to Bangladesh for our garments, for example, break them up into lots of little segments, and we push all the risk down to the men and women, often women in the garment supply chain, at the bottom of the supply chain. And then we keep all the profit at the top. And as we're talking about with COVID, what we see there is that, you know, if actually things go wrong at the other end of the supply chain, it's going to disrupt the whole supply chain. So we need to move from a just-in-time sense of manufacturing, for example, to a just-in-case sense, a much more resilient approach that builds in that redundancy. And, you know, in the first instance, we might have to pay a little bit more for our t-shirts, for example. But if we're buying a t-shirt for, you know, a couple of pounds on the high street, you've got to ask yourself, how is that possible? And the only way that is possible is, frankly, somebody's getting ripped off. And it's not you, the consumer, which means it's somebody else in the value chain.
James, that leads us on to our next question, which is, for all of our listeners today watching this video, what can they do right now from the comfort of their own home, or perhaps after COVID and their lockdowns are lifted? What can they do to play their part in eradicating modern slavery, in your opinion?
Yeah, I would say think with your heart, if I can put it that way. You know, people who are listening to this are probably a self-selecting group who have a fair degree of compassion. And if they've made it this far through the video, then they're probably pretty committed to this cause. So I would say, think about how you interact with the economy. And you're going to get a lot of people saying, think about what you buy. Yes, very important. I just made that point about the t-shirt. But let's be honest, it's also pretty hard when you go into a high street store. It's pretty hard to know, was this t-shirt made with forced labor or not? That it's very opaque, the value chain. It takes a lot of effort and time. It's not easy. People don't have that time. So I would say, think about how you can also use your economic power in other ways to contribute to structural change. And for example, if you have any savings or investments, or even just deposits in the bank, you can ask your bank, what is your approach to modern slavery? And in the UK, most banks will be caught by the legislation that requires them to disclose that. So you can simply go to their website, it should be on their front page or somewhere close, have a look at their Modern Slavery Act statement and see what they're doing to think about whether they are, when you give money to a bank, it uses that money to lend to somebody else. So you can ask them, it's your money, you can ask them, are you using my money to support firms that are relying on modern slavery or forced labor? Because I really would prefer you don't do that. And if you're an investor, if you have a pension or some other kind of investments in stocks, for example, you can similarly ask those companies, what are you doing to make sure that you're not supporting firms that are investing in modern slavery? I'd actually like my money to reward firms that are doing the right thing, not to reward firms that are doing the wrong thing.
And also, can you talk a little bit, I mean, if you know, Jules and I always like to ask to people to end on sort of a story of hope that they'd like to share. It doesn't have to be something from the last few months in lockdown, but you know, it's nice to hear if anything good is coming from, you know, the situation that we're in. But yeah, we'd love to hear from you a story of hope that can inspire people.
Yeah, I would say actually it's something from the Financial Sector Commission that we were talking about before. I mean, at one level, the work being done by the survivors there and how they educated the 23 other members of the commission was truly inspiring. But there was actually a particular moment, you know, you look for those particular epiphanies, and there was one moment where I was just really energized in that commission. We had an incredibly diverse group of people on the commission. As I said, we had Muhammad Yunus, whose life story is about finding ways to bank and ensure the absolute poorest of the poor, the people who've been left behind by the global economy and financial system. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we had, for example, the chief investment officer of the world's largest hedge fund. So you could expect people along that spectrum to have very different approaches to some of the questions we were asking them. And there was one particular day in January of last year, 2019, when we took them all to Liechtenstein. They were the sponsors of this commission, and they all met the hereditary prince, who's very impressive. We asked them to think about their approach to the responsibilities of business for these issues. And you would expect that there would be quite a diversity of views, people from all different parts of the capitalist economy. They might have rather different views about how business should approach its responsibility. But in a remarkably short time, less than 2 hours, they coalesced around a unanimous approach, a consensus approach, that firms should not just be held responsible for the risks to business, for managing risks to business, but actually for managing risks to people. That when we think about risk in the financial markets and in the economy generally, we have to be thinking not just about profit, but people and planet as well. And that's a real, I think, watershed moment, certainly in my experience of these discussions, to have leaders of the financial sector like that, recognizing and articulating that that's their role in society. It's not just to maximize shareholder value, but to think about the broad array of stakeholders that are impacted by their businesses and try to make sure that we're effectively managing risks for all of those people. That really gives me hope and keeps me going.
Thank you so much, James, for sharing all of your wonderful words of wisdom today. I think some key takeaways for our listeners would be, I'm going to use this again and again. Number one, think with your heart.
Yeah.
Think about how you interact with the economy. Number two, you can learn more by visiting Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking, and we'll include the website in our bio. And thirdly, COVID is a time that is going to make those at the very, very bottom of the supply chain more vulnerable, and potentially slavery even worse. But as James said, COVID is also proving that we as one generation can affect real change in a very, very short space of time. So I think if anything, that is a huge, huge learning to take away from lockdown and these work from home conversations. So thank you so much, James.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.